record on this computer. All right. So my name is Sean Redmiles. I'm the director of the Fauquier History Museum at the Old Jail. Pretty much since, I want to say, August, we've been doing these virtual lectures. We used to do these in person, obviously, every month. But with the pandemic, we wanted to do something that we could still reach out to people, still get amazing history to them, but do it in a safe way. And the support people have had for us has been awesome. We've had a lot of people come to these. It really, really means a lot to not just me, but to everybody here at the museum and the board. So thank you, everybody who's come today, and definitely look for some of the other ones that we're doing in the future. Our guest today is Dr. Peter Henriques. Just a short bio. He got his PhD in history from the University of Virginia, and he was a professor of history from George Mason University. His most recent book, I have right here with me, is First and Always, A New Portrait of George Washington. I have read it. It is excellent. We are going to be talking about just one section of this book, but if you have not had the opportunity to purchase this, I highly recommend it. And Dr. Henriques can talk more about it during the talk, and then at the end, if you have any questions that even go past what he's going to be talking about. Dr. Henriques, I'm going to give it over to you. Thank you so much for coming.
Thanks, Sean, and it's a pleasure to be here. I do wish I could look out and chat with everybody. That's just one of the curses of the times we're living in. They'll be better, and maybe in the fall we'll do it again, and I can see the people in person. But as Sean mentioned, I do have some work in terms of
not now, Susan. I'm listening to a lecture.
You want
that
okay?
I just muted him. Yeah, we're good. So yeah, so folks, make sure you keep those mute buttons on. Okay, go ahead, Dr. Henriques.
Oh, as Sean mentioned, my new book, First and Always, which is a new portrait of George Washington. In the first chapter, I focus a little bit on George Washington, what made him such a great leader. In the first place, I just want to emphasize, think of his leadership. There's never been a more important leader in America than George Washington. If you look at his record in terms of popularity, he was unanimously elected Commander-in-Chief of the Continental Army, unanimously elected President of the Constitutional Convention, unanimously elected the first President of the United States, unanimously re-elected President of the United States, and after his presidency, he was unanimously nominated as Commander-in-Chief of all the forces in the quasi-war with France. No other American leader can claim to have enjoyed such popular enthusiasm. But Washington wasn't only popular, he was consequential, a man of vision and action. There were really two seminal events in the founding of our great nation: winning of independence from Great Britain and the establishment of nationhood. And the two are not the same thing. In both of those dramatic events, George Washington was the central and crucial figure. But for him, there would be no single nation known as the United States of America that would stretch from the Atlantic to the Pacific. In briefest essence, no George Washington, no America. Without him, there wouldn't have been a union for Abraham Lincoln to save. Now, granting that Washington was the remarkable leader sketched above, begs the question, how was he able to achieve such a remarkable record of success? While the reasons will inevitably always be somewhat debatable, what I find, there are 10 factors that I combined to put in combination to make, he needed all 10 of these factors, I think, to do it. I want to mention them all now, and then I'll look at each one in just a little more detail. First and essential, he needed good fortune. He had to be very, very lucky, whether it be luck, fortune, providential interference. Washington is remarkably fortunate. Secondly, his physicality plays a very important role in his ability to be as successful as he was. Third, his ambition. Fourth, his determination. Fifth, his passion. Sixth, his courage. Seventh, his toughness. Then his philosophy. Then his many talents. And finally, his character. These 10 things combined together to allow him to be the remarkable leader that I sketched. Now, it might be an exaggeration to say that Washington was the luckiest man that ever lived. Some people have said it, but he is at the apex of good fortune. As Thomas Jefferson put it, never did nature and fortune combine more perfectly to make a man great. Washington is amazing when you look at the number of good things that happened. I don't have time to go into it, but he's the right man at the right time over and over again. And without luck, frankly, no one is going to be a president. Biden wouldn't be president if Trump had not been president. And frankly, Trump wouldn't have been president if Obama hadn't been president. And Jimmy Carter wouldn't have been president if it had not been for Nixon and things like that. It's interesting the way these things happen. Rather than just being lucky to be at the right man at the right place, I was struck by how often Washington almost ended the story not being written. See a picture of Sally Fairfax. If Sally Fairfax had encouraged him to do something reckless, what if he had joined the British Navy as he wanted to, if his mother had allowed him to do so? On the other hand, what if he had done in terms of his activity with the British Commission? He wanted to be a British officer. If they had given that to him, life would have been a lot better for the British. If one of those bullets that ripped through his clothes in the French and Indian War had been off just a slight little bit different, it would have made all the difference in the world. So I think there are a number of things that really play a significant role in terms of Washington simply being lucky along that line. So that's part of the story. That the more important part of the story is, of course, not only was he lucky, but his characteristics. I want to stress first his physical persona. Washington was, except for his bad teeth, he had made the most of nature's gifts. He has an impressive exterior. He looks the part of a leader, especially a military leader. You know, Mel Gibson might be able to play the lead role in Braveheart. Somehow I can't see Danny DeVito playing that part. Washington's a superb physical specimen. The brand new uniform that he wore to the Second Continental Congress highlighted his physicality. He was roughly 6'2" tall. That's equivalent to 6'5" today. Powerfully built, a man of absolutely prodigious strength, and combine that power with a graceful carriage and a majestic walk. He was a superb athlete. He was acknowledged as the best horseman in Virginia, which is like being the best athlete in your school. And he took fencing lessons, not because he expected to run anyone through, but to improve his graceful movements. He was a marvelous dancer, another highly prized skill. There are countless contemporary accounts that testify to his charismatic persona. I'll give you a couple of them, and I really could spend the rest of the time discussing these things. It's amazing how many people make comment about it. There was in his whole appearance an unusual dignity and gracefulness that once secured a profound respect and cordial esteem. He seemed born to command his fellow men. The French ambassador, Count Moustier, he has the soul, look, and figure of a hero united in him. Born to command, he never seems embarrassed at the homage paid to him. And he has the advantage of uniting great dignity with great simplicity of manner. Another man commented, while he had been presented to the kings of England and France, he never felt as he did when presented to George Washington. One French officer after another made similar assessments. Benjamin Rush put it, Washington had so much martial dignity that you could pick him out to be a general from among 10,000 people. And he added, there wasn't a king in Europe who would not look like a butler next to George Washington. In other words, this is an important part, but an impressive exterior, while crucial, explains only a small part of the reason for his success. Other factors were of equal importance. First, Washington is profoundly ambitious and eager for both honor and for history's most elusive prize, fame across the ages. I like to call it the desire for secular immortality. He had a desire to excel all competitors, conquer and surpass himself. Essentially, he strove for magnificence. Paul Longmore, in his excellent book on the invention of George Washington, expressed it this way in his book. Throughout his life, the ambition for distinction spun inside George Washington like a dynamo, producing astounding energy with which he produced his greatest historical achievement himself. He's a driven man, very much a type A personality. And when he encountered adversity and disappointment, he parried them with tenacity and perseverance of incomparable intensity. One might call it the audacity of determination. His indomitable will made him a formidable adversary. As the financier of the American Revolution, Robert Morris, expressed it, Washington feeds and thrives on misfortune by finding the resources to get the better of them, whereas lesser leaders sink under their weight, thinking it impossible to succeed. Morris saw in Washington what he called a firmness of mind and a patience in suffering that gave him an infinite advantage over other men. And believe me, if you've studied the American Revolution at all, you know Washington needs every bit of determination and patience and suffering to manage. When you look through some of the excerpt of his letters, the way he suffers time and again, no peace, just his mind constantly on a stretch. As he wrote to his brother Jack, you can form no idea of the perplexity of my situation. No man, I believe, ever had a greater choice of difficulties and less means to extricate himself from them. Such is my situation, that were I to wish the bitterest curse on an enemy on this side of the grave, I put him in my stead with my feelings. Now, Washington's ambition and his determination had their match in his passions. Often forgotten today, Washington was a man of the most intense passion. You know, the commonplace image of Washington, he's aloof. Think of the Washington Monument, cold, no human touch. Think of the Jefferson Memorial and the Lincoln Memorial. They have a humanity that most people don't give to Washington. He's cold and lifeless, but in actual fact, Washington is a man of the most intense passion. Gouverneur Morris, who wrote the best eulogy of Washington, said those who have seen him strongly moved will bear witness that his wrath was terrible, that they have seen boiling in his bosom passion almost too mighty for man to control. Such an image flies in the face of conventional wisdom, but I believe it's true nevertheless. Yes, he presents to the world the face of a cool, aloof, and distant man. He does so partly for political reasons, but also because over time, he becomes a man of almost granite self-control. As he told his granddaughter, passion ought to be under the control of reason. And over time, his will proves stronger than his passions in almost all cases. You know, second in fame only to Gilbert Stuart's scholar portrait of Washington, and in my opinion, vastly superior to it, is the bust by the great French sculptor Houdon. Houdon's portrait, he came to Mount Vernon, spent a week at Mount Vernon, sculptured, the life mask He made a life mask. He made the bust that is Mount Vernon's most famous possession that he left. And he went back to finish the statue that's at the Capitol at Richmond. And Houdon travels around with Washington for a week to try to understand him. And this unbelievable life work, this is as close as you'll get. I love this particular picture of him. And as you can see from the kind of picture I used, taking a different view of this bust for the cover of my magazine, because of my book, rather, it catches Washington's charisma. Houdon wanted to show him as a man in an unending struggle with his passions. If you look closely at the bust, you'll see that Washington's right eyebrow slightly raised, his nostrils slightly flared, his unsmiling lips, which lead the viewer to the realization that he's quietly fuming in indignation. But he has his temper on a leash, which is why if you look at the bust's distinctive topography, it's undistorted by anger. When Gilbert Stuart, who painted Washington, and he was a brilliant painter, Stuart, this is the same image, another wonderful photographer giving a different view. This is the charisma of Washington comes through so much more here than in the dollar bill portrait. Gilbert Stuart said he discovered in Washington's face features totally different from what I'd observed in any other human being. He pointed out the sockets of his eyes, he said, are larger than ever he had met with before. The upper part of his nose broader. He went on to say all his features were indicative of the strongest passions. He makes the interesting comment, had Washington been born in the forest, he would have been the fiercest man among the savage tribes. Now, that might not be politically correct, but the image it projects is a good one. And Washington exuded the dignity of an Indian sachem and possessed the courage of a ferocious warrior. And courage was another key aspect of Washington's factors that allowed him to be such a great leader. Early in his military career, he said, I flatter myself I have resolution to face whatever any man dares to do, as shall be proved when it comes to the test. And time would show this is no idle boast. Humankind esteemed bravery. And Washington, as Jefferson put it, seemed incapable of fear, meeting personal dangers with the calmest unconcern. His displays of courage as the commander-in-chief of the Continental Army worried his aides, but it inspired his ranks. Many of his soldiers put as one John Holland, a private, put it, the firm, composed, and majestic countenance of the general inspired confidence and assurance. Another one said his appearance alone gave confidence to the timid and imposed respect on the bold. His personal bravery, the desire he has of animating his troops by example, makes him fearless of any danger. A good example is at the Battle of Princeton. Washington was as close to enemy gunfire as a pitcher is to a batter in baseball. Almost foolhardy valor among the falling shells at Yorktown, his actions at Monmouth, cool like a bishop at prayer, one person described. And by his baptism by fire, Washington wrote to his brother an amazing comment where he said, I heard the bullets whistle, and there's something charming in the sound. And not many men are wired that way. Now, not only was Washington courageous, he was also tough. At the core of his being lived a steely will in which greatness, in which gentleness played a very little part. There's a wonderful, interesting, and I think inaccurate, but still important comment by a visitor that went to Thomas Jefferson's home after he had visited Mount Vernon. He didn't particularly like Washington, like Jefferson. He said, this is in 1799, a man by the name of Joshua Brooks. And he summarized in his journal what he thought was Jefferson's view of Washington. And this is what he wrote. It's a very interesting and not particularly well-known passage. He talked about Washington as a hard, Jefferson did, as a hard master, very severe, a hard husband, hard father, a hard governor. From his childhood, he had always ruled and ruled severely. He was first brought up to govern slaves. Then he governed an army and a nation. He thinks hard of all, is despotic in every respect. He mistrusts every man and thinks every man a rogue, and nothing but severity will do. Now, personally, it's impossible to know, did Brooks actually accurately record Jefferson's views? And certainly, that assessment that I just read you, I think, is unfair and biased. But it points to an important fact that is important to remember, that namely, in addition to his ambition, determination, passion, and courage, toughness was also an important part of Washington's character structure. Frankly, sometimes it manifests itself in unflattering ways, but it's necessary for his overall success. Now, he was a tough man in different ways. First, it's simply the matter of Washington's physical toughness. As he wrote as a young man to Governor Dinwiddie, I have a constitution hardy enough to undergo the most severe trials. When he went to warn the French as a young man of 22 in an amazing winter journey over hundreds of miles to try to tell the French to stay out of the Ohio Territory, it's the stuff of legends. And when he and the rugged frontiersman Christopher Gist were traversing the Allegheny River and their raft capsized, it was Gist, not Washington, who suffered frostbite. As a military disciplinarian, Washington did not flinch from the responsibility of imposing harsh punishment, depriving miscreants of the skin off their backs, and on some occasion, even their lives. The master of hundreds of slaves, Washington was willing to send recalcitrant slaves to certain death in the Caribbean, use the whip to enforce compliance. To discourage thievery, he had some slaves' dogs drowned to deprive their owners of four-footed lookouts. Isaac, an enslaved worker, later described when his tree felling, he was cutting down trees and did it improperly, displeased Washington. Washington, he said, without a word, gave me such a slap on the side of my head that I whirled around like a top before I knew where I was and master was gone. Now, that kind of toughness has a negative side, but for the position he faced, he had to do that. And I think his hard shell enabled him to make and to stand by necessary but unpopular decisions. For example, he refused to authorize a plan to free captured American officers because of what he felt it would mean for those that were still imprisoned. At one point, he refused to exchange POWs because it would benefit the British more than the Americans. Despite great pressure, and this is a talk I'm working on now for Williamsburg, and a fascinating story on Benedict Arnold, he insists that Major Andre should be hung rather than shot because of his role in Andre's plot, in Arnold's plot. But it cost him a lot of anguish to make that decision. He felt that espionage must be dealt with in that way. He signed the much scorned Jay's Treaty out of the conviction that the arrangement was in the nation's long-term interest, and therefore he was willing to put up with criticism in order to do that. And as Rick Atkinson noted in The British Are Coming, which is an excellent new book on the Revolution, Washington learned and lived the hardest of war's truths, that for the new nation to live, young men must die, often alone, usually in pain, and sometimes to no obvious purpose. In Washington's words before one battle, what brave boys I must lose. But this is an important aspect necessary, I think, to his. Another factor is Washington's philosophy. It's a critical component of his success as a leader. I wrote an earlier book on George Washington that I call Realistic Visionary, a portrait of George Washington. That's why I call First and Always a new portrait of George Washington. It basically takes different aspects of his life and examines them. And I called the book Realistic Visionary. And at first, you might say that almost seems like an oxymoron, like an optimistic pessimist or a generous miser. Most visionaries, rather than being realistic, tend to be idealistic and utopian. By the way, I think it's worth remembering that the word utopia comes from the Greek words meaning utopos, means no place. So when someone's going to take you to utopia, a politician or anyone else, whether they use the word or not, be cautious about it. Washington was the exact opposite of a naive idealist. As Joe Ellis put it, he was a rock-ribbed realist. He had a relentlessly realistic view of how the world worked and a shrewd understanding of human nature, perhaps in part because he went to war instead of to college, and he saw the rougher side of life. Gouverneur Morris asserted that Washington's knowledge of human character, quote, was an inestimable gift to his country. Frankly, Washington has a pretty conservative, dark view of ordinary people. Jefferson once said he's inclined to gloomy apprehensions. He recognizes almost viscerally the caprice of the world. As he put it in one of his many quotes along this line, what gracious God is man, that there should be such inconsistency and perfidiousness in its conduct. Or, I have seen so many instances of the rascality of mankind that I'm convinced that the only way to make them honest is to prevent them from being otherwise. Washington's starting point was clear. We must take the passions of man as nature has given them. Interest is the driving force in men and nations. Small knowledge of human nature will convince us that with far the greatest part of mankind, interest is the governing principle. And that is, almost every man is more or less under its influence. As he put it in a letter to James Madison, in a summary, the motives which predominate most in human affairs are self-love and self-interest. It's vain, he wrote, to exclaim against the depravity of human nature on this account. The fact is so, and the experience of every age and nation has proved it. And we must in great measure change the constitution of man before we can make it otherwise. No institution not built on the presumptive truth of these maxims can succeed. Really, this open-eyed annealing of ideals and interest was a theme that Washington believed in utterly and acted upon. A great quote, "We must make the best of mankind as they are, since we cannot have them the way we wish them." Now, Washington was able to make the best of mankind as they are because of another aspect in the 10 factors. And that is, frankly, he's awash in talents. He's a very talented person. And with the other things, without the talents, would not, of course, work. Foremost among his many talents was a keen intelligence, a phenomenal memory, remarkably astute judgment, and a profound understanding of power and how best to exercise. Absolutely crucial is Washington's impressive intellect. Almost all biographers recognize that Washington had a good heart, but most don't give adequate attention to his good head. And it's the combination of the two, his good heart and good head, that were central to his success as general and later as president. Had a phenomenal memory. There's a Polish nobleman who wrote that in visiting Washington, they got talking about geography, and Washington seemed to know every river, creek, and lake from Portsmouth, Maine, down to the Mississippi. And as an executive, Washington could ingest and distill huge amounts of data quickly and act on it. He knew how to get things done. Thomas Jefferson put it, his executive talents are superior, I believe, of any man in the world. Now, they were superior in part because he was a very astute judge of character and ability. I think really Washington's judgment was a key part of his genius. He was able to spot young talent. His ability to recognize and utilize the expertise. Washington once referred to people who had minds far abler than mine. But he opened doors for young, brilliant generals, like, for example, Henry Knox and Nathaniel Greene, young statesmen like James Madison and Alexander Hamilton, among others, because he was comfortable in his own skin, confident in himself, clear about his beliefs and goals. He was willing to deploy his charisma. He actively sought the aid of these blossoming geniuses, and he inspired these young geniuses without yielding control or compromising himself. Now, besides a keen intelligence, a phenomenal memory, and astute judgment, Washington had a profound understanding of power and the best way to exercise. When I use the word power, think of power as the ability to achieve intended effect. There's a little book by Edmund Morgan, one of the great American historians, The Genius of George Washington, now over 40 years old. But he argued that Washington's genius lay in his grasp of both military and political power. He was actually a better politician than he was a general, in some ways a political genius. Now, Washington was never one of the boys. He's not a fun boss. He's not someone who you'd slap on the back and have a beer with. Frankly, he's an elitist by temperament, upbringing, and philosophy. And he believed that a certain amount of separation was necessary to support a proper command. Power required distance. Familiarity and intimacy eroded it. To grow upon familiarity was, in a sense, to sink in authority. Interesting thing about Washington is, though, this remoteness did not repel. It was softened by an air of what I call modesty, shyness, self-deprecation that created an appealing whole. Madison explained the appeal of what he called Washington's modest dignity. And modesty was every bit as an important part of his personality as was his courage. Abigail Adams, one of the most interesting of all the founding mothers, put it this way when she wrote one of my favorite quotes from her, and she's got many about Washington. I'm working on a relationship between her husband, John Adams, and Washington. It's a fascinating one. John Adams has a lot of mixed feelings. Abigail Adams, I've never found a negative quote by Abigail Adams about Washington. This one's particularly good in my opinion because she explains that Washington possessed a dignity that forbids familiarity, mixed with an easy affability that creates love and reverence. A Frenchman put it that Washington had mastered the art of making himself beloved. This ability to ingratiate himself to others helps explain his charismatic appeal and his superlative management of leaders, both as general as president. And Abigail's quotes point to another of Washington's many talents. This and countless similar comments highlight Washington's great skill in what one author calls the politics of self-presentation. Few men had a more finely developed sense of what constituted proper public conduct. Acutely sensitive to the perceptions and expectations, and intensely aware of the scrutiny attending any man of his station, Washington rigorously cultivated his public image. He was a lifelong lover of the theater, Washington was no stranger to play acting, and he often employed it deliberately as leadership called on his theatrical qualities. Throughout his life, Washington had a magnificent sense of stagecraft and proved himself a master in the use of effective gesture, more than once bringing participants to tears. He wasn't a great speaker, but he was capable of remarkable eloquence. And these incidents did not just simply happen by accident. There's an interesting quote by an author, Phil Smucker, who put it this way: invariably, I found that through the years, not only did Washington perform at an amazing level in public and on the field, but he also meticulously studied his own performance and the public's view of it. If he was a consummate actor, he was also an accomplished director of the man in the mirror. Now, don't take this notion of Washington as an actor simply at face value without qualification, because in Greek, the word for actor in Greek is hypocrite, one pretending to be what he is not. Washington is no hypocrite. He believed in and lived the role he played, which was the embodiment of revolutionary virtue, a symbolic figure around which the country could rally. And he applied this skill in the politics of self-presentation to unite the people of America behind independence and Republican government. The unifier is a wonderful name that really should be Washington's nickname, because it distinctly captures what he wants to achieve. He's a collaborator. He often puts aside personal grievance and insults in order to promote larger goals. An interesting quote that we perhaps have not seen much of in the recent past: I've undergone more than most men are aware of to harmonize so many discordant parts. In other words, he put up with a lot of you-know-what. I believe his words in praise of a French admiral give insight to his own mindset. It's an interesting quote where he wrote, "A great mind knows how to make personal sacrifices to secure an important general good." Washington was one of those rare individuals with the capacity to rise above the emotions of the moment and recognize what really mattered. That is the embodiment of revolutionary virtue. Must be willing to do, make sacrifices to secure the important general good. And he tries hard to create this kind of mutual forbearance among people. Unity, not division, is what he stresses over and again. When one of his generals was going to quit in a peak, Washington said to him, quoting his favorite play, Cato, "Surely every post ought to be deemed honorable in which a man can serve his country. Don't let personal pique keep them from serving the greater cause." Someone like Benedict Arnold will not follow this advice. There are two quotes I could give you, one from the war, one from his presidency, good summary of Washington's views. The first: how strange it is that men engaged in the same important service should be eternally bickering instead of giving mutual aid. Officers cannot act upon proper principles who allow trifles to interpose to create distrust and jealousy. Or in trying to stop the clash between Hamilton and Jefferson, he wrote, "How unfortunate and how much it is to be regretted that whilst we are encompassed on all sides by avowed enemies and insidious friends, that internal dissensions should be harrowing and tearing at our vitals. Unless corrected, in my opinion, the fairest prospect of happiness and prosperity that was ever presented to man would be lost, perhaps forever." Now, in George Washington, remarkable talents interlaced with the last of the 10 factors, remarkable character. For him, character was truly destiny, as the ancient Greeks imagined When they codified that aspect of humanity, the Greeks say character is a combination of four factors: fortitude or courage, temperance, prudence or wisdom, and justice. First, fortune. Fortune is basically the strength of mind, along with physical and moral courage, to persevere in the face of adversity. Winston Churchill opined that courage is the greatest virtue because it enables and enhances all the other virtues. Washington always admired stoical courage. There is a strong aspect of stoicism in Washington, the way he'll face suffering and pain, the way he faces his death. There's a good quote that all of us should remember, especially as we get through the challenges of aging, where Washington said this: "I hope that I shall possess sufficient degree of fortitude to bear without murmuring any stroke which may happen." Secondly, temperance. Temperance is the self-discipline necessary to rein in appetites and passion. Washington came to embody one of my favorite quotes, is from Epictetus, who's one of the most interesting of all Stoic philosophers. And he put it this way: "No man or woman is free who is not master of him or herself. The key to freedom is self-mastery." And Washington reserved some of his sharpest words for drunkards because of their implicit lack of self-control. The third quality among the four of the Greeks, in addition to courage and temperance, is prudence. Prudent, practical wisdom that enables a person to make the right choices in specific situations. As Joe Ellis expressed it, Washington's core quality was judgment, the ability to make sober and highly realistic assessments of the strategic options facing the infant American Republic and get the decisions right every time. Fourth, and in some ways most important, is justice, which collects beneath its rubric fairness, honesty, lawfulness, and the dutiful keeping of promises. According to Dwight Eisenhower, the essential quality in a great leader is absolute integrity, and Washington had it. He wrote an interesting comment to a friend in 1786. I wonder how many of us could write something like this: "I do not recollect that in the course of my life I ever forfeited my word or broke a promise made to anyone." His impartiality was one of the great pillars of his public character. Jefferson said his justice was the most inflexible I've ever known. No motives of interest or family connection or a friendship would be able to change his or bias his decision. To conduct oneself with integrity, especially in a crisis, is the fundamental test of character. As Epictetus put it, it is difficulties that show what men are. Now, Washington obviously was a great man in the sense of his impact on history. Fortunately for us, he was also a good man. Teddy Roosevelt put it, Washington was the greatest of good men and the best of great men. He sought not mere celebrity, but honest fame. The path Socrates said, "How do you get honest fame?" Socrates said, "Study to be what you wish to be seen." In other words, work to be how you wish the world to view you, to be that kind of person. Washington did basically become the man he wished to be, the embodiment of revolutionary virtue. It's really striking how closely his behavior reflected his ideals and how hard he worked to enter the temple of fame, but only through the doors of the temple of virtue. In Washington, charisma and leadership melded in such a way that Abigail Adams, to quote her one last time, she makes a very interesting comment. She said, you know, George Washington could have been a very dangerous man because he has the power to get people to do what he wants. But then she also recognized that he is happily, she said, one of the best intentioned men in the world. So he puts his talents to work, not in self-aggrandizement, but to lead the country in what he called the glorious cause of establishing and expanding liberty and Republican values. The gift and opportunity Washington gave to his beloved country were priceless. Of course, how we use it is up to us. I don't know whether you've given attention or not. I hope you have. I hope you've enjoyed the talk, and now we certainly will open it up to questions either on the talk or anything about Washington that you wish. I can't answer all the questions, but I don't mind you asking anything that's on your mind. So I'll kind of turn it over to Sean if he has gotten anything chat, or people can click on and ask questions that way, and we can do that for a little bit. And I'll let Sean, you take it from here, and we'll move on. Okay.
Thank you so much, Dr. Henriques. That was awesome. Yeah, so guys, if you have a question, we can do this two ways. We can either have you write it in the chat and I'll read it to Dr. Henriques, or you can come onto video and wave your hand, or you can come off of mute and ask the question. So I think we've got somebody. Is there somebody coming on right now that would like to ask? Go ahead.
Go ahead.
Well, it's Paul Pizer here, Sean. How you doing?
Hey, I'm great. Good to see you.
Dr. Henriques, I don't seem to be able to get on video. I see my name and I've unmuted it, but okay. So I'll ask my question. You, Dr. Henriques, you certainly identify a set of qualities that Washington possessed that were undoubtedly very effective, both in helping win the war and subsequent governing of the country. But undoubtedly, there must have been some downsides to this. I mean, he was so self-possessed and apparently did, in fact, believe in his apparent superiority in so many ways, and yet he had a rather negative view of the average person. How did he negotiate those differences between him and others without running into problems? I do, if my memory serves me, there were a couple of attempted mutinies within the Continental Army during the war, weren't there?
Absolutely. Okay. You know, it's not an easy question to answer briefly, because it complicated. It is a complicated question in terms of Washington's sense of superiority in one sense. But the thing that strikes me about Washington, he is very aware of what I call common shared humanity of all people. Washington has respect. I mean, there's comments over again where he would bow to the meanest person who recognized him. Yes, he is a great man, but there is a deep sense of modesty. It's interesting. What makes him, I think, a very appealing character is though he has this great desire for success, for secular immortality, and a certain amount of confidence, it's mixed in with a sense of insecurity. Washington he has the desire for success mixed with a fear of failure. He has one of the chapters in my book deals with his very complicated and key relationship with his mother, which I entitled Complicated, Very Complicated, and try to examine that. So Washington is not superior in the sense of I am different and better than other people. And that's, I think, one of the things that make him so appealing is that he has this kind of self-deprecation. And it's not it is not an act that's put on. I mean, I'm going to be giving a talk down at Colonial Williamsburg in a couple of months on Washington's death. And the remarkable way that in this greatest crisis, and he suffers a great deal, how he treats other people with respect, how he actually has his personal servant sit down and worries about causing other people trouble as he's going through virtual hell himself. These are very appealing. These are very appealing qualities. Obviously, Washington has, you know, as I try to talk about in my book, I obviously you can tell I like Washington. I mean, in terms of true confessions, I wear a medallion of him around my neck. But that doesn't mean that he's a flawed person. I mean, he is super sensitive to criticism. He's sometimes excessively greedy. He has these elements. Well, I've got a chapter on his relations with the slaves, and there's some sad chapters in there. And his relations, he breaks his relationship with Jefferson, with Madison, with Monroe, with George Mason, with Edmund Randolph. There's things don't always go smoothly, and he'll have his critics. But really, when you think of what he managed to do, the overall record is really one which I don't think we'll match again.
That was a great question, Paul. Thank you. Let's get one from the chat. So this is from Cynthia. And it's actually a question that I was going to ask too, more or less. This says, what other leaders would you put in the top echelons of leadership with qualities like Washington's, Churchill, and Lincoln? And I'll say for my part that as I was listening to you talk about Washington, I noticed a similarity in the general part of Washington. Washington has a general with Grant, but of course, president-wise and ability to judge character, not so much. But as a general, I noticed some similarities. What other names would you put in terms of leadership that had the same qualities that Washington had?
One of the more recent figures, actually, in terms of the way he was viewed and the impact he had on his country, was Nelson Mandela. Mandela had the same kind of almost otherworldly aura among people, that the charisma that people felt. And South Africa's history would have been dramatically different if it had not been for that one man and his ability. I knew apartheid had to end in South Africa. I thought it was going to end in a terrible bloodbath because of Mandela's ability and qualities of a leader. It did. I think there's no question in my mind that the three greatest American leaders in my order is Washington is the greatest, Lincoln is second, and Franklin Roosevelt is also a very, very remarkable leader along that line. These are people at the very top. You know, when you have people like Nelson Mandela or Martin Luther King, there's a different kind of leadership at a lower level. We're talking about the people who actually have gotten to the top leadership in their country. Mahatma Gandhi in India is another remarkable leader. You know, in terms of greatness of influence, people like Mao Zedong are remarkable leaders. Much less, they're not admirable, but they are crucially important people. People like Julius Caesar and Alexander the Great, Napoleon. I mean, one of the things that strikes me about Washington is that he's basically a decent, good person within the framework. And obviously, slavery is a great controversy that we could discuss within the time frame. But some of these other people that are obviously great, in one sense, Adolf Hitler is a great leader in the fact that he had tremendous impact on history, but obviously in a super negative way. The fact that people don't realize, to me, how unlikely it is that we would have one country from the Atlantic to the Pacific. There were so many forces pulling apart the nation. Obviously, we ultimately had to go through a terrible civil war to remain one nation. But without Washington was the glue, people didn't really know much about the government, but he was so popular and so admired. Obviously, not by everyone. He has his enemies, and there are newspapers that you can read in the Aurora newspaper by Benjamin Franklin's son, Benjamin Franklin. They rake him over the coals. I'm not saying everyone's bowing down before when he dies, one person wrote, it's like everyone's father died at the same time. You couldn't buy black mourning clothes and ribbons. They was all gone. Everyone was so taken by Washington's rather sudden demise because he was healthy at the time of his death. It wasn't a long time coming. So those are some of the people off just the top of my head that come to my mind.
Great. That was a great question, Cynthia. And I like this question from Cynthia too. So we'll do this one next. She asked, did Martha Washington play a meaningful role in Washington's success as a leader? And maybe if she helped him with any of those traits that you showed he possessed.
I'm glad you brought that up. In my plug for my first book, Realistic Visionary, I have a whole chapter on Washington's relations with his mother. With his wife. In this book, I have it on with his mother. In Realistic Visionary, Martha Washington is a crucial figure in Washington. Absolutely crucial in different ways. One, because she was the wealthiest widow in Virginia, and his marriage to her put him at the very top echelon of the Virginia hierarchy and allowed him not to have to kowtow to anybody else like he sometimes did when he was younger and ambitious. But she's the wind beneath his wings. She's kind of maybe an old-fashioned mate, not dominant, not brilliant like Abigail Adams, but someone who Washington depended on, needed. One of the most interesting things to me is during the war, Washington insists that his wife come and visit in the wintertime, every single winter. Mary Thompson and Mount Vernon figured out that Washington and Martha actually spent almost more than half the time of the war together. He needed that because she was the one, he's always on display. Everyone is always looking on him. Finally, there's someone, she gives him the kind of unconditional love that his personality, his mother did not do that. He grew up without the kind of normal, deep, his father died when he was 11. His mother was a very complicated woman, but did not give him the kind of praise and assurance that people want and need. And Martha really, I think, fulfills that role. She was very popular with the soldiers, very popular later on. She was not, if you read her letters, they're all messed up in grammar and things of that nature. She's not as witty and smart as an Abigail Adams or some of the other early, like Eliza Powell, who was Washington's very interesting female friend. But this is not a dramatic, great Hollywood love story where they can't race to throw each other's arms. But it's a deep, abiding kind of love. So I feel Martha really is very important. And really, one critic said to Washington at one point, where would you be if it weren't for the widow Custis? Because it was her wealth that opens up the door for him to do some of the things that he was going to do. But it was a lot more than money that she gave him.
Excellent. Great question, Cynthia. So guys, it is 8 o'clock, but we have a couple of really good questions that Dr. Henriques, if you're okay going a little longer.
Happy to keep going.
Excellent. But for everybody else, if you guys need to head out, that's totally okay. I just want to quickly plug that we are doing another virtual lecture on February 6th. It's going to be called How Virginia's Enslaved Cooks Helped Invent American Cuisine with Dr. Kelly Dietz. And then on March 20th, we have Dr. Edward Ayers coming to talk about his book, In the Presence of Mine Enemies, which is a fantastic Civil War book. And I'm so excited that he's coming. So check those out, join us for them. We'd love to have you guys. So if you need to head out. But I want to ask this question from Cynthia, because it seems like a really good one. She wondered, about you mentioned his elitism, and I think she had a question about that whether it was because he wanted to be seen and accepted as an equal to other British landowners in the homeland. And even though colonial wealth was not seen as the same as true aristocrat in England, and how much did Fort Necessity affect his later life? So she had a two-part question there, but I thought that was a good one.
Well, the elitism in Virginia society is a very hierarchical, patriarchal society. That is the society in which he grew up and was comfortable with. I mean, there was a recognition of superiority in a way that would be very much frowned on them. And one of the interesting things really with Washington, and you mentioned about the British, he wanted to be in the British elite, and he never got the commission. He wasn't, the British looked down at the Americans. And he couldn't understand why, since he was superior or capable to do it, why couldn't he do it? And what really happens in America, what makes it so special, is that the aristocratic time of just birth being crucial is going away. It opens up the possibility for people of talent to rise in a way that you can't do in a stratified society. But it's before we move towards democracy and the emphasis on equality. Here, you're comfortable enough that there is a sense of a natural elite kind of people. So it's a different world. Washington would be very uncomfortable in this world. He would not function in it, and it would not nearly go through all the crap one has to do in order to be a leader. But he's born right at that time where the aristocratical thing is dying and the democracy has not yet come in, which is perfect. The Fort Necessity situation, that's in the French and Indian War, where Washington, after he starts the war at the Humanville affair, marches out to try to take the French fort, which is at the forks of the Allegheny River, where Pittsburgh is now. And he is met by a superior French force, comes close to being killed, ends up signing a surrender document that people interpret that he admitted to murdering a diplomat. He gets in a lot of trouble, but he learns from it. I think I want to look at it again. David Rubenstein has a section on leadership. And the one thing I remember that popped up here that I want to just mention, one of the key traits in almost all successful leaders is failure, which you would not necessarily think. I didn't mention it tonight. Fort Necessity was a dramatic failure. Washington is not always successful. And I think sometimes, apparently, this is almost an essential ingredient to later fame, to have some disappointments and setback. I don't know if that's the point she wanted. If she's another question on Fort Necessity, I can go into more detail.
I love that. No, that was excellent. Okay, so this is a question about, you said, you quoted referencing GW as acting in severity in almost all things. Would you describe GW as tough but fair, or was he just living the role as the alpha and didn't waver from that role?
I'd certainly use the word fair, absolutely. He was not tough in a bullying sense. He was his discipline, his hanging of soldiers and stuff, and he hung as few as possible. He always wanted to use them as an example. He did feel with with soldiers, and we love the patriotic spirit at 1776, but a lot of these guys are tough, poor people who desert and steal and get drunk and commit atrocities and so on and so forth. It is not that easy to do this. Yeah. But certainly, I've never seen any sign that Washington would be tough in a mean, unnecessary kind of sadistic way. It was always a toughness to a purpose that he felt it was essential to do this for a greater purpose, but not because I'm the general, get out of my way, or I'm going to, slap you or something like that. You have that kind of quality.
Okay. Is there anyone who wanted to come on voice and ask a question? And then if not, I'll do the one that I had, which is the last one we'll do. But if you want to ask one, go ahead now.
Can I ask one more question?
Please go right ahead. Yeah.
What did Washington expect of both his slaves and other owners' slaves during the war? Were any promises made to slaves? And what was the outcome of those promises? Were they kept or reneged on for the most part? Whatever.
It's another big, fairly long question. Answer briefly. Initially, Washington was opposed to the concept of any black troops in the army. He changed his mind ended up recognizing that the black soldiers made a significant contribution. And actually, in Virginia, there were moves where you could have, in some of the when people were drafted, you could send a substitute slave in, and they were supposed to get their freedom, and there were moves to stop that afterwards. So the issue of slavery is something, frankly, that the founding fathers and Washington in particular wants to keep on the back burner. Washington envisioned more clearly, I think, than any other founding father, the vision of America as a great and big and united country. But it's weak and fragile now. If slavery becomes the central issue, it will destroy the Union. There's no way that if slavery is brought up front and center, that the Southern states are going to stay in the Union, and no way that they could be kept in the Union. Washington's view, and people might criticize me, he privately writes some very critical letters that slavery must be abolished, and quite critical of it. He's the only founding father slaveholder who frees his slaves in his will. And he does that to make an example. Not only does he free them, but he says the young blacks should be taught to read. And that's a very unusual thing. So he's trying in his last will, so to speak, make an effort. But when the Quakers bring a petition to try to end slavery, he wants it buried. Because if it becomes the central issue, just like at the Constitutional Convention, if they did not allow blacks to count in part for population, if they did not allow the slave trade to continue, the Union wouldn't have been formed. And a lot of people say, we made a deal with the devil and it was a bad decision. Others say, in the real world of choices, if you want the Union to succeed, there's some issues that are just too sensitive to deal with now, and they put them off. And whether that's the right thing to do, we'll see that in a different form in some of the more radical proposals for equality and maybe retribution for slavery and payments that could be very divisive in our own time. But the Washington felt he needed to keep it on the back burner.
Mm-hmm. Thank you.
Okay, let's finish on this question that I had, because it kind of ties that one a little bit, and with something else that you said during the presentation. So you mentioned Washington's, constant sort of determination to desire for unity. Unity has been a big word lately, obviously, where there's no secret that we're living in a divided nation. And I guess I was wondering if you were if you were a leader right now, what are the traits that you talked about, one of the 10 traits or two of the 10 traits that Washington had that we would most need right now in order to get that unity or to help kind of bring a divided nation together?
It's not an easy question to answer right off the top of my head. That at the end I talked about character, which is so central. But I guess my own view, one of the most important is when I listed philosophy and a realistic philosophy. You are some people don't act the way philosophers feel they should very often. And a leader has to recognize this may sound good, and why don't we do these things? You have to judge what is realistic. Washington always took the view that you have to be realistic about what can be achieved, and to insist on goals that are not really achievable can end up, however good they sound, being counterproductive. I think Washington's caution would be an important aspect along that line, and his patience and determination. It's a difficult thing. It's human. Pick any time in American history, and I mean, really, at Washington, 1790s. I just did a talk on the election of 1800, which is unbelievably divisive. The 1790s is the most divisive time in America, except for the coming of the Civil War. And frankly, our own time is extremely divisive in the aftermath of the Trump presidency. Whether Biden will in fact be able to move towards a more normality, only we're in the middle of the story. I don't know how that's going to end. I mean, I hope, to be honest with you, just on a personal basis, America is a center-right country, and if Biden has policies that are too far to the left, even though they might sound very admirable, they're likely to bring a reaction that will make the situation worse. I think Biden is the right man for this time because he is a unifier and he's a man of significant empathy. But whether the more liberal wing of the Democratic Party will end up causing division within that party in the nation, I don't. We're in the middle of the story. But the one thing I think, just to close on, when you look at American history, in some ways we're never whole. We're like some inarticulate beast going into the future. We're too wounded to be robust and healthy, but we're too powerful to succumb. And I like sometimes on my good days, I see the wonder of our great experiment, the wonder of democracy, and I feel good. Other days I focus on the weaknesses and the racism and the problems, and I feel bad. But this is a remarkably strong system, and bruised as it is, it will go on, and it will be bruised again in ways we can't see. But it's really been an amazing story. So I would not despair. I would move hopefully into the future, and we're part of the story. And how we act and what happens will be the way the story will ultimately.
Well said. I think that's a great point to end on. Thank you so much, Dr. Henriques. I really, really can't tell you how much we appreciate you coming and doing this. To everybody who came, thank you guys so much as well. Yeah, I'm seeing claps from people. Yeah, thank you guys so much for coming and joining us with this. This will go up online, so if you missed any part of it, you can see the beginning and the middle. And if you missed anything else, you can come into that. We'll be doing more of these, just like I said, guys, and just check us out on Facebook and online. And then a last plug, of course, to Dr. Henriques' book. It really is an amazing book. We only got to just one chapter of it today, but there are so many parts of this book that are worthy of exploring. Hopefully we can get Dr. Henriques to come back and do some of those chapters. There's parts about the founding fathers and their splits with Washington. As you mentioned, there's stories of the enslaved people of Washington. There's a lot of really amazing stuff in this book. So I really recommend that you purchase it. You'll learn so much more about George Washington than you'll get from really any book out there right now. And we hope we'll have him back. Have a great day, everybody. And thank you, Dr. Henriques.
Thanks. Good to talk to you with you, Sean. Bye-bye, everybody.
Bye.
How hard is that to do it?
I didn't know it.
Okay, so that's it, right?
Right.
So how do we get on to this?
All right. That was great, Dr. Henriques. Man, what a way to end. That was awesome.
I'm glad you enjoyed it. Oh, look, it looks like my sister.
Oh, your sister did.
You had some people in the chat say, I just wanted, before you left, I don't know if you read it, but Jim and Celia said that this was a fantastic talk, as always, and we always learn a lot when we hear from you. So that's really cool. And then Cynthia said, amen to your closing observations, well said. And my mom said, excellent presentation. And Jim says, thank you for another interesting lecture.
Well, I'm glad we got a couple of positive responses. And okay.
Awesome.
Take care of yourself.
Take care, Dr. Henriques.
Okay.
Thank you so much.
Bye-bye.